There is something psychologically fascinating about people who were born in the 1990s. They belong to a generation that grew up standing on the invisible border between two completely different worlds. One world was slow, quiet, and analog. The other became fast, loud, and digital. People born in the 90s didn't simply live through change. They absorbed it. They are the generation that remembers childhood without smartphones but adulthood completely defined by them. They are old enough to remember waiting for things, yet young enough to live in a culture that expects everything instantly. And psychologically, that creates something unique, because when a person grows up during massive social and technological transition, their mind develops a strange dual awareness. Part of them still carries the patience and innocence of a slower era, while another part of them has been trained by the chaos of modern life. That contradiction lives inside them every single day. To understand people born in the 1990s, you have to understand the strange psychological tension they carry. They are nostalgic, even though they are still young. They feel old sometimes, even though society still calls them young adults. And deep down, many of them carry the quiet feeling that they grew up too fast. Think about a typical childhood for someone born in the early or mid-1990s. Their memories might include riding bicycles until the streetlights turned on, watching cartoons on television at a specific time because there was no streaming service, playing outside with friends instead of texting them. Their childhood environment rewarded presence. But something slowly began to change. The internet arrived. First, it was slow dial-up connections, noisy modems, and shared family computers. The internet was not something you carried in your pocket. It was something you visited for a short time. Then social media slowly appeared. And without realizing it, this generation became the first group of people whose identity began forming both offline and online at the same time. Psychologists often refer to this as dual identity development. For previous generations, identity formed primarily through real-life social interaction. Friendships happened face-to-face. Social status existed within small physical communities. But people born in the 90s experienced something new. Their sense of self began expanding into digital spaces. Suddenly, reputation wasn't limited to school hallways or neighborhoods. It existed on profiles, posts, comments, and likes. And when a young mind grows up during that transition, it learns something powerful but also psychologically complicated. Your identity can exist in multiple places at once. For many 90s kids, their teenage years were spent learning how to navigate two realities simultaneously. One reality was physical life, school, family, friends, awkward teenage experiences. The other reality was digital life, profiles, messages, photos, silent pressure of being seen online. This is where the psychology of this generation begins to deepen. Because for the first time in human history, a large group of people grew up with the constant awareness that they were being observed, not just by family or friends, but by an invisible audience. Every photo posted, every comment written, every opinion shared, all of it could be seen, judged, liked, ignored, or criticized. And when people grow up with that level of observation, their brains develop a unique sensitivity to social perception. Many people born in the 90s learned early how to read the emotional signals of others. They became experts at interpreting subtle reactions, a delayed reply, a message left unseen, a post with fewer likes than expected. These small digital interactions might seem insignificant to older generations, but psychologically, they trained the 90s generation to constantly monitor social feedback. And over time, that creates a strange internal habit. They begin to question themselves more. Did I say something wrong? Why didn't they reply? Do people like me? This doesn't mean the entire generation is insecure, but it does mean that many people born in the 90s developed an unusual level of self-awareness. Sometimes that awareness becomes emotional intelligence. Sometimes it becomes overthinking. And sometimes it becomes quiet anxiety that no one else can see. Another fascinating psychological trait of people born in the 90s is their relationship with nostalgia. Even in their 20s or early 30s, many of them already feel deeply nostalgic about childhood. Why? Because the world they grew up in disappeared extremely quickly. In previous generations, cultural change happened slowly. A childhood environment might remain relatively similar for decades. But for 90s kids, the world transformed in less than 20 years. Think about it. A child born in 1995 might remember DVD players becoming streaming services, MP3 players becoming smartphones, chat rooms becoming social media empires, landline phones disappearing, maps becoming GPS, physical photo albums becoming digital memories. The speed of that transformation created a strange emotional effect. Their childhood feels like it belongs to a completely different era, and when people feel like their past exists in another world, nostalgia becomes stronger. Psychologically, nostalgia is not just about missing the past. It is about trying to reconnect with a time when life felt simpler and identity felt clearer. For many people born in the 90s, childhood represents a time before constant comparison existed, before social media quietly turned everyone into performers, before adulthood arrived with financial pressure, career uncertainty, and endless digital noise. Another psychological theme often seen in this generation is something researchers sometimes call the pressure paradox. People born in the 90s were raised during a cultural moment that repeatedly told them one message: you can become anything. Teachers, parents, and media constantly reinforced the idea that success was limitless. Follow your passion, chase your dreams, change the world. But adulthood introduced a much more complicated reality. Economic instability, competitive job markets, rising living costs. And suddenly, the limitless possibilities they were promised began colliding with very real limitations. Psychologically, this creates something known as expectation dissonance. Expectation dissonance occurs when the life someone imagined for themselves clashes with the life they are actually experiencing. And for many people born in the 90s, this tension shows up in subtle ways. They may appear successful on the outside, but internally they sometimes feel behind. They may be doing reasonably well, but they still wonder if they should be doing more. They scroll through social media and see friends buying houses, starting businesses, traveling the world, getting married, and quietly they ask themselves, am I falling behind? This internal comparison can be exhausting, because the human brain was never designed to constantly compare its life to thousands of other lives. Yet for the 90s generation, that comparison became normal. But something else developed alongside that pressure: resilience. Because people born in the 90s also witnessed enormous change and uncertainty. Economic recessions, global events, technological disruption. They watched the world transform repeatedly. And when people grow up in unpredictable environments, they often develop a psychological survival skill, adaptability. They learn how to adjust, how to reinvent themselves, how to learn new skills when old ones become irrelevant. This is why many people born in the 90s are comfortable navigating multiple careers, industries, and identities. They grew up during instability, so their minds became flexible. They know the world can change quickly, so they quietly prepare for it. Another subtle psychological characteristic of this generation is emotional awareness. People born in the 90s were among the first groups raised during a time when mental health conversations began becoming more visible. Previous generations often suppressed emotional struggles, but 90s kids slowly witnessed a cultural shift. Words like anxiety, burnout, depression, and self-care began entering mainstream conversation. As a result, many people born in the 90s developed a deeper emotional vocabulary than earlier generations. They may not always have perfect mental health, but they often have the language to describe what they are feeling. And that awareness can be powerful, because when people understand their emotions, they can eventually learn how to manage them. But emotional awareness also has a shadow side. When people become deeply aware of their internal world, they sometimes feel things more intensely. They notice stress earlier. They question their life direction more often. They analyze their relationships more deeply. In other words, they feel life more consciously. And conscious living can be both beautiful and exhausting. People born in the 90s often carry a quiet mixture of hope and uncertainty. They want meaningful lives. They want purpose. They want relationships that feel real. But they also know the world can be unstable. So they live with a strange psychological balance. Optimistic, yet cautious. Ambitious, yet sometimes overwhelmed. Connected, yet occasionally lonely. And this emotional complexity is not a weakness. It is simply the natural result of growing up during one of the most rapidly changing periods in human history. The story of people born in the 1990s is not just about age. It is about adaptation. It is about learning to build an identity in a world that never stops shifting. And in many ways, their psychological journey is only beginning. Because the real transformation of this generation happens not in childhood, but in adulthood. There is a moment that many people born in the 1990s eventually experience, though few talk about it openly. It usually happens sometime in their mid-20s or early 30s. Life slows down for a moment. Maybe they are scrolling through their phone late at night. Maybe they are driving alone after a long day. Maybe they are lying in bed, staring at the ceiling while their mind refuses to turn off. And suddenly a strange thought appears. How did everything change so fast? It's not just about getting older. Everyone gets older. What makes the experience different for people born in the 90s is the speed of transformation they witnessed while growing up. They didn't gradually step into the modern world. They were pushed into it while it was still forming. Their childhood was simple enough to feel peaceful, but their adulthood arrived inside a world that moves almost too fast to process. And psychologically, that creates a very specific internal experience. Many people born in the 90s feel like they are constantly trying to catch up with life. Not because they are lazy, not because they lack ambition, but because the world they were preparing for during childhood doesn't fully exist anymore. Imagine preparing for a race your entire life, only to discover that the track changed shape right before the starting line. This is one of the quiet psychological realities of the 90s generation. When they were young, the path to success seemed relatively clear. Study hard, choose a career, work your way upward, build stability. But by the time many of them reached adulthood, that path had already become unstable. Industries began disappearing. Technology replaced entire professions. Freelance work replaced traditional employment. And suddenly, the idea of a predictable life became uncertain. This uncertainty didn't just affect their finances. It affected their identity. Because for many people, identity is deeply connected to what they do in the world. When the structure, work becomes unstable, people begin asking deeper questions. Who am I really? What do I actually want from life? Am I choosing this path or just surviving it? And this is where many people born in the 90s begin experiencing something psychologists call the identity reevaluation phase. In previous generations, identity often became stable earlier in life. People chose careers, settled into routines, and stayed on relatively predictable paths. But for the 90s generation, identity is more fluid. They change jobs more often. They explore different lifestyles. They question traditional expectations about relationships, work, and success. To older generations, this sometimes looks like instability, but psychologically, it is something deeper. It is exploration. People born in the 90s are not simply trying to find a job. They are trying to find meaning. And meaning is much harder to define than a paycheck. Another fascinating psychological pattern within this generation is something many researchers describe as quiet loneliness. From the outside, people born in the 90s appear more connected than any generation before them. They have hundreds or even thousands of contacts online. They can communicate instantly with people across the world. They can join communities around any interest imaginable. But despite all this connectivity, many of them still experience a subtle sense of emotional isolation, because connection is not the same as closeness. A message notification is not the same as a conversation. A like on a post is not the same as being understood. And deep inside, human beings still crave something ancient and simple: presence. Someone sitting across from them. Someone listening without distraction. Someone seeing them not as a profile but as a person. For people born in the 90s, this kind of connection sometimes feels harder to find. Not impossible, just rarer. And when meaningful connection becomes rare, people begin protecting themselves emotionally. They become more cautious about trusting others. They reveal less about their true struggles. They present the best version of themselves to the world while quietly dealing with their uncertainties alone. You might know someone like this. Maybe it's even you, a person who seems calm, capable, and successful on the outside. But internally, they carry questions no one else sees. Questions like, am I living the life I actually want? Why do I still feel unsatisfied even when things are going well? Why does everyone else seem more certain than me? These questions are incredibly common for people born in the 90s, not because they are confused, but because they are conscious. They are aware of how many possibilities exist. They know they could live in different cities, pursue different careers, choose different lifestyles. And when the human mind becomes aware of endless possibilities, it becomes harder to commit to just one path. Psychologists sometimes call this the paradox of choice. When choices are limited, decisions feel simpler. But when choices become endless, decisions become stressful. Every decision feels like closing the door on another possible life. And the 90s generation lives inside a world overflowing with options, endless careers, endless information, endless comparisons. So they move carefully, they analyze deeply. Sometimes they overthink, but their carefulness is not weakness. It is the mind trying to navigate complexity. Another psychological trait that often appears in people born in the 90s is their complicated relationship with ambition. They are ambitious, but not always in the traditional sense. Many of them do not want success at the cost of their mental health. They do not want wealth if it means sacrificing all their time. They question the old belief that a person's worth should be measured purely by productivity. Instead, they search for something different: balance, purpose, freedom. This doesn't mean they reject success. It means they want success that actually feels meaningful. And this desire sometimes places them in conflict with traditional expectations. Older generations may see them as unrealistic, but from the inside, their mindset makes perfect sense. They have seen how quickly life can change. They have watched industries collapse. They have watched people burn out chasing goals that never truly satisfied them. So they ask deeper questions earlier in life. What kind of life is actually worth living? And once a person begins asking that question, it becomes impossible to return to blind ambition. This is why many people born in the 90s feel like they are building a new definition of success. Not one based only on money or status, but one based on personal fulfillment, meaningful work, healthy relationships, and emotional well-being. Of course, this journey is not easy, because society still rewards traditional success more visibly than internal fulfillment. So many people born in the 90s live in a quiet tension between two worlds. One world pushes them toward external achievement. The other pulls them toward internal peace. And learning how to balance those two forces becomes one of the most important psychological challenges of their lives. But something remarkable happens during this process. As people born in the 90s continue navigating uncertainty, comparison, ambition, and identity, they slowly develop a deeper understanding of themselves. They become reflective. They begin recognizing patterns in their own behavior. They notice what drains their energy and what gives it back. They become more selective about who they allow into their lives. And gradually, something changes. The confusion of early adulthood begins transforming into quiet self-knowledge. Not perfect clarity, but direction. And direction is often more valuable than certainty, because certainty can disappear overnight, but self-knowledge stays with you. People born in the 90s are still writing the psychological story of their generation. They are the first adults who fully experienced childhood before smartphones and adulthood completely shaped by them. They understand both worlds, and that understanding might become their greatest strength, because the future will belong to people who can adapt, people who can evolve, people who can build meaning even when the path forward isn't perfectly clear. And the 90s generation has already been practicing that skill their entire lives. But the most powerful psychological transformation for this generation is still ahead. Because eventually, people born in the 90s stop asking the world for direction and start creating it themselves. At some point in their lives, many people born in the 1990s begin to notice something unusual about themselves. It usually doesn't happen suddenly. It happens slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. They start realizing that the confusion they felt for years was actually shaping them. The uncertainty they struggled with, not just chaos, it was training. Because growing up in a rapidly changing world forces the mind to develop abilities that more stable environments rarely demand. And one of the most important of those abilities is deep thinking. People born in the 90s often spend a large portion of their lives thinking about things that previous generations rarely had time to question. They question the meaning of success. They question traditional life paths. They question societal expectations about work, relationships, and identity. And sometimes this constant questioning makes them feel like something is wrong with them. They look around and see others who seem more certain, more confident, more stable. But what they don't realize is that their questioning mind is not a weakness. It is actually a form of psychological evolution. A mind that questions is a mind that refuses to live unconsciously. And people born in the 90s grew up in an environment that forced them to become aware very early. They saw how quickly life can shift. They saw how systems can change. They saw how technology can reshape society almost overnight. So naturally, their minds became cautious, reflective, observant. Many of them developed a habit of analyzing situations deeply before trusting them. They analyze people. They analyze relationships. They analyze opportunities. Sometimes they even analyze their own emotions until they understand exactly why they feel the way they do. To outsiders, this can look like overthinking. But psychologically, it is something more complex. It is adaptive awareness. When a person grows up in an unpredictable environment, their brain learns to observe patterns carefully. It becomes skilled at detecting subtle changes. And this awareness eventually becomes one of their greatest strengths. Another trait that quietly develops in many people born in the 90s is resilience. But their resilience doesn't always look dramatic. It doesn't always involve huge visible struggles. Instead, it appears in small everyday ways. They learn how to start again after disappointment. They learn how to adjust plans when life changes direction. They learn how to rebuild motivation after periods of burnout. And perhaps most importantly, they learn how to continue moving forward even when they don't have all the answers. Because if there is one thing the 90s generation understands deeply, it is uncertainty. They have lived with it long enough that it no longer surprises them. Instead of expecting life to be predictable, they gradually accept that unpredictability is simply part of the human experience. And once a person accepts that truth, something inside them becomes stronger. They stop waiting for perfect conditions. They stop expecting everything to be clear. They start moving forward anyway. That quiet ability, the ability to move forward without certainty, is one of the most powerful psychological skills a person can develop. But perhaps the most defining characteristic of people born in the 90s is their search for authenticity. They are not satisfied with living purely according to external expectations. They want their lives to feel real. They want their work to matter. They want their relationships to be genuine. And if something feels fake, forced, or meaningless, it becomes harder for them to tolerate it for long. This search for authenticity is not always comfortable. It often forces them to confront difficult truths about their lives. Sometimes they realize they are following a path that doesn't truly belong to them. Sometimes they discover that certain relationships drain more energy than they give. Sometimes they recognize that the life they thought they wanted was actually something society taught them to want. These realizations can be painful, but they are also incredibly important, because awareness is the first step toward transformation. And people born in the 90s are becoming one of the most self-aware generations in history. They talk about mental health. They discuss emotional struggles openly. They explore self-development, psychology, and personal growth in ways that previous generations rarely did. This does not mean they have solved all their problems. Far from it. But it does mean they are trying to understand themselves more honestly. And that effort alone represents an enormous cultural shift. Another interesting psychological pattern within the 90s generation is their relationship with time. Many of them feel like time moves too fast. They remember childhood vividly. They remember simpler moments that now feel almost distant, like memories from another lifetime. And sometimes they feel like adulthood arrived before they were fully prepared for it. But over time, something changes in their perception. They begin realizing that life was never meant to feel completely stable. Every generation experiences uncertainty. Every generation faces moments when the future feels unclear. The difference is that the 90s generation became aware of this reality earlier. And that awareness, while uncomfortable at times, also makes them wiser. Because once a person understands that life is unpredictable, they begin focusing on what truly matters. They value experiences more deeply. They become more intentional with their time. They appreciate meaningful connections instead of superficial ones. And gradually, the pressure to live a perfect life begins to fade. Instead of chasing perfection, they start chasing alignment. alignment between their actions and their values, alignment between their work and their purpose, alignment between the person they are and the life they are building. This process doesn't happen overnight. It unfolds slowly through years of trial, mistakes, and self-discovery. But by the time many people born in the 90s reach their 30s, something remarkable begins happening. They start understanding themselves. Not completely. No one ever does, but enough to make better decisions. Enough to recognize what truly fulfills them. Enough to stop living purely for the approval of others. And that moment of self-understanding is incredibly powerful. Because once a person begins living according to their own truth, their life becomes more stable internally, even if the world around them remains chaotic. The story of people born in the 1990s is not just the story of a generation caught between analog and digital worlds. It is the story of a generation learning how to build identity in a constantly shifting environment. They are thinkers, adapters, observers, searchers for meaning. They may sometimes feel lost, but that feeling often comes from their refusal to live unconsciously. And in many ways, that refusal might become their greatest strength. Because the future will not belong to the people who simply follow old systems. It will belong to those who can question them, understand them, and rebuild them when necessary. People born in the 90s have spent their entire lives preparing for that challenge. And perhaps one day they will look back at all the uncertainty they experienced and realize something surprising. It wasn't confusion, it was preparation. They weren't falling behind. They were learning how to navigate a world that no generation before them had ever experienced. And in doing so, they were quietly becoming something powerful. A generation that doesn't just adapt to change, but understands it.